What if I told you the greatest threat to US global dominance isn't China, Russia, or even war, but a strategy quietly enabled from inside the White House? While Trump claims to put America first, China and Brazil are getting richer, stronger, and closer. And BRICS is rising. If you think this doesn't affect you, think again. This is happening right now, and the consequences are already irreversible. Before we begin, here's why this channel exists. We don't chase headlines. We track patterns. We go beneath the surface to reveal what most ignore. If you feel the world's shifting faster than anyone can explain, you're not wrong, and you're not alone. This is for people who want to understand what's really happening, not just to watch, but to be ready. Because when you see the game clearly, you don't panic, you prepare. If that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. Now let's get back to that abandoned car factory in Brazil. Because what happened there could shape the next decade. Every empire fades, but not always with a bang. Sometimes it starts with silence. And for the US, that silence might sound like this. An abandoned car plant in Brazil. Rows of Ford vehicles rusting in the sun, while just blocks away, another factory is humming with life. But this one isn't American. It's Chinese. BYD, electric, expanding. The future, spoken in Mandarin. This isn't about cars, it's about power. Economic, strategic, symbolic. And back in Washington? Same message. America first. A slogan meant to restore dominance. But maybe it did the opposite. When Trump launched his trade war on China, few saw what it would trigger. Not conflict, realignment. Brazil didn't get crushed. It pivoted. China didn't fold. It partnered. The result? A stronger BRICS, new alliances, and a global power shift. Quiet, but real. What you're about to see isn't about one policy. It's about what that policy unlocked. And there's one detail, one thread, that connects it all. But it's not what you think. We'll come back to that. It didn't start with a treaty or a military alliance. It started with a word: BRIC. In 2001, Jim O'Neill, an economist at Goldman Sachs, coined the term in a report that few outside financial circles read at the time. He wasn't building a political bloc. He was forecasting profit. His thesis was simple. Brazil, Russia, India, and China were the future of global growth. 4 letters. One prediction. But what happened next? Nobody truly saw coming. What began as an investor's label turned into a coalition of rising powers. In 2009, these 4 nations held their first summit in Russia, not to share markets, but to share visions. And in 2010, South Africa joined, adding the S to BRICS and anchoring the group to the African continent. On paper, they were too different to align. Different languages, governments, religions, geographies. But they shared something far more powerful. A frustration with a system that always kept them just outside the circle of influence. Behind closed doors, BRICS became more than a symbol. It became a subtle rebellion against the post-Cold War world order. An answer to a question nobody in the West was asking: what if the next era of global power didn't come from within Washington or Brussels, but from outside? But there's something strange about that first BRICS summit. One decision was made that didn't make headlines, yet it quietly set the stage for a very different world today. I'll come back to that, because once you understand it, the rest of this story becomes impossible to ignore. When Donald Trump launched his trade war against China in 2018, the intent was clear: reassert American dominance and force Beijing into a less favorable position. Tariffs were raised. Agreements were torn apart. The world watched as the two largest economies entered open economic confrontation. But in trying to isolate China, something else happened. Something no one in the Situation Room had likely planned for. Instead of crippling China's ambitions, the trade war drove Beijing to deepen its ties with other emerging powers. One of them was Brazil. Facing growing friction with the West, China turned to the global South, offering not just investment, but partnership, on terms the West never bothered to match. Brazil, long marginalized in global trade decisions, saw an opportunity. And Beijing? It saw food security, rare minerals, ports, and a diplomatic beachhead in Latin America. But this shift wasn't just economic. It was ideological. The more the U.S. pulled away from multilateralism, the more space it created for alternative visions of global order. Between 2021 and 2024, trade among BRICS nations surged by over 40%, driven in part by sanctions on Russia. These weren't just reactions, they were rehearsals for a new system, one that didn't need the dollar. That's where things start to unravel. As Western sanctions pushed Russia into financial isolation, it began trading in yuan, rupees, and reals. A red line had quietly been crossed. A significant volume of international trade was now bypassing the US dollar. China, in particular, began converting massive amounts of its overseas transactions into its own currency. This wasn't just a financial adjustment, it was a strategic repositioning. But there's a moment in 2019 that few remember, one where a simple agricultural deal between Brazil and China revealed the fault lines of a new alliance. I'll return to that moment, because it wasn't about soybeans, it was about sovereignty. The year was 2004. Brazil, under President Lula's first term, became one of the first countries to recognize China as a market economy. It was a diplomatic gesture, but also a strategic signal. Lula understood something that Washington didn't yet grasp. Brazil and China didn't just have compatible economies. They had complementary imperatives. One needed food, minerals, and land. The other needed markets, capital, and infrastructure. That quiet alignment only deepened. By 2009, China had overtaken the United States as Brazil's largest trading partner. While Washington debated tariffs, China built ports. While U.S. companies exited, Chinese firms expanded. The Ford factory closure in Brazil wasn't just about profit margins, it was about a vacuum, one that BYD filled with electric vehicles and a vision of industrial partnership that looked more like the 21st century. But here's where it gets more intricate. China's investment in Brazil was not just opportunistic, it was architectural. It aligned with Beijing's larger strategy of reshaping global logistics through the Belt and Road Initiative. Brazil wasn't officially part of it, but many of the same dynamics were in motion. Infrastructure, influence, dependency. This shift wasn't just visible on the ground, it was visible in the numbers. Brazil's exports to China didn't just grow, they redefined the country's external dependency. And yet, in Brasilia, the rhetoric remained neutral. Brazil didn't want to choose sides, but the numbers chose for them. Now, remember that agricultural deal from 2019? It involved a Chinese purchase of Brazilian soybeans after U.S.-China relations soured. On paper, it was just a trade adjustment. But something strange happened in the diplomatic cables that followed. Something that suggested this wasn't just about crops. I'll return to that, because what was exchanged wasn't just cargo, it was loyalty. By 2024, BRICS was no longer just 5 countries. 4 new members joined that year, and by early 2025, Indonesia had entered the fold. 10 nations spread across continents, ideologies, and economies. Some of them rivals outside the BRICS umbrella. On paper, it looked like a victory. In practice, it revealed the paradox at the heart of this coalition. strength in size, weakness in structure. The numbers are staggering. As a bloc, BRICS Plus now accounts for nearly 40% of global GDP by purchasing power parity, more than the G7. This isn't speculative economics, it's demographic reality, resource distribution, and consumption power. But unlike the European Union or NATO, BRICS Plus isn't bound by treaties, common defense, or shared regulation. It's a coalition of convenience, not a community of values. Still, some institutions are forming. The new development bank, headquartered in Shanghai, has begun issuing loans across the global south with fewer political strings than the IMF or World Bank. Its message is subtle but powerful. We'll finance your roads, not your values. And for many nations burned by Western conditionality, that promise carries weight. Yet even inside BRICS Plus, fault lines run deep. India and China remain locked in territorial disputes. Brazil leans westward on climate diplomacy. Russia, under heavy sanctions, needs BRICS more than BRICS needs it. There is no common market, no unified currency, at least not yet. But proposals for a shared monetary system have already been floated, aiming to bypass the dollar and reduce exposure to Western financial systems. But that's where the contradiction tightens. For BRICS to become a true counterweight to the G7, it needs cohesion. And cohesion requires compromise, something not all members are willing to make. There's a meeting transcript from the 2024 Johannesburg summit that never made headlines. It revealed something quiet, something unresolved. I'll return to that, because inside that silence is the reason BRICS might never reach its full potential, or why it might suddenly surprise everyone. The core irony is this: in trying to withdraw from the world to protect itself, the United States has inadvertently created space for others to lead. The promise of America First assumed a zero-sum game, where stepping back would not invite others forward. But history doesn't tolerate vacuums. And global leadership, once abandoned, rarely stays empty. What Trump set in motion wasn't isolation. It was acceleration. The retreat from multilateralism, the disdain for global institutions, the transactional diplomacy, they all signaled to rising powers that the old order was vulnerable. And perhaps more importantly, that it was unwilling to adapt. For countries like Brazil, India, or even South Africa, this opened a window not just to participate, but to shape. That shaping is now visible in how nations negotiate. Where once the IMF dictated, now the new development bank whispers alternatives. Where the dollar once reigned supreme, now bilateral trade in yuan and rupees is quietly normalized. These are not revolutions. They are recalibrations. But taken together, they amount to a profound shift. And the global South is listening. Across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, the narrative is changing. The idea that the West is the only arbiter of development, security, and progress is being challenged. Not by force, but by offer. Cheaper credit, fewer conditions, strategic investments. These are the tools of 21st century influence. Yet within Washington, the debate remains oddly frozen. Caught between nostalgia for Cold War clarity and domestic political chaos, the U.S. still sees its own primacy as self-evident. But there's a quiet memo circulating inside a State Department subcommittee. It warns of a pattern too subtle to headline. A pattern that suggests U.S. retrenchment is not just temporary. I'll come back to that. Because if it's right, the next shift won't be economic. It'll be systemic. Empires don't collapse with noise. They dissolve through neglect. And in that neglect, new powers test their reach, not with tanks or treaties, but with credit lines, infrastructure projects, and trade deals that bypass the old rules. What the United States viewed as disengagement, the rest of the world interpreted as an opening. And China took it. What Trump envisioned as a recalibration of American strength became, for others, an invitation to reconfigure global influence. Brazil didn't defect, it drifted. Towards markets that were faster, lenders that were quieter, and partners who didn't ask for ideological alignment. That drift isn't over. In fact, it's only beginning. The future of BRICS Plus isn't guaranteed. The divisions are real, the cohesion fragile, the purpose still debated. But its existence alone signals a break. A refusal to accept that the global stage will forever be reserved for those who built it after World War II. It's not yet a rival empire, but it is a rehearsal for one. And that moment we paused earlier, the 2024 Johannesburg Summit? In one closed-door session, a delegate from a founding BRICS country asked a question. What if the West doesn't try to stop us, because it no longer can? There was no reply, but the silence, they say, felt like agreement. So where does that leave us? In a world more uncertain, but also more open. For every strategic withdrawal, there is a countermove. For every abandoned factory, a new blueprint. If the United States is losing ground, it's not because it's weak, it's because it blinked, and others didn't. The map is redrawing itself, not with force, but with subtle realignments. And if you've watched this far, you already know. This isn't just about Trump or China or Brazil. It's about understanding power when it no longer announces itself. Because in the end, the future doesn't declare victory. It just shows up, quietly. Then everything looks different. If this story stirred something in you, an unease, a question, a sense that the world is shifting beneath our feet, then you're not alone. And that's exactly why this channel exists. Here, we don't just talk about geopolitics, we talk about mindset, about courage in uncertain times, about the discipline it takes to build something lasting, while the old systems fade. We bring you the context behind the conflict, but also the strategy behind success. Because understanding power isn't just for diplomats, it's for anyone building a future, family, business, or dream, in a world that's constantly evolving. So if you value clarity over chaos, if you believe that knowledge leads to freedom, and if you're someone who wants to not just survive the next chapter, but shape it, subscribe to this channel. Leave a like if this gave you new perspective. Share it with someone who needs to see what's coming before it arrives. The truth is, the world is shifting, but that doesn't mean it's breaking. With the right understanding, the right mindset, and the right preparation, we don't just make it through. We rise. Because even when the empires change, even when alliances shift, there's always a way forward. And together, we'll find it.